Good morning. I'm Victoria Taylor. I'm the director of the Iraq Initiative. Thanks for joining us today for this panel hosted by the Iraq Initiative and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias are among the groups that are part of the so-called Axis of Resistance, a network of armed groups formed by or supported by Iran in order to serve as its forward defense. These groups have served as the asymmetric threat that helped bolster Iranian deterrence against perceived or real threats from the United States and Israel. Yet over time, each of these groups has evolved in different ways, with some becoming more independent and embedded in their local political systems, and others remaining more fundamentally tied to Iran and more responsive to Iranian direction. And at this moment, when Iran is facing the most existential threat to the regime since its founding, each group faces a different set of circumstances and made its own choice about whether to enter this current conflict. The Houthis have yet to enter the fighting. Hezbollah and Israel are locked in their own conflict, and the most hard line of Iraqi militias are currently launching strikes in Iraq, while other militias are sitting it out. So today we have a stellar group of experts to help frame how we think about the axis of resistance in the context of this current conflict and how the war in Iran will impact the groups, how their relationships with one another will evolve, and to what extent their relationships with Iran will continue to define the groups in the future. And just a reminder, we will take questions at the end of our discussion, so please submit your questions to askac.org. So let me first introduce our panel. We have Dr. Renad Mansour, who is director of the Chatham House Iraq Initiative and is a senior research fellow with their Middle East and North Africa program. Renad has conducted extensive research on Iraq's militias and the axis of resistance. We have Nicholas Blanford, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a defense and security correspondent for IHS Janes. Nicholas is based in Beirut and is the author of Warriors of God Inside Hezbollah's 30-year struggle against Israel, amongst numerous other publications on Lebanon and other countries in the region. And we have Allison Miner, who is director of the Atlantic Council's project on Middle East security integration, and she is former deputy special envoy for Yemen, and also served as the director for Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the National Security Council, among other positions in her government career. So first, I'm going to start with Renad. Renad, you've written extensively about the Axis actors and their ability to adapt, their resilience in the face of Israeli and U.S. efforts to dismantle the groups. Now, the U.S. and Israel are not just targeting the proxies, but they're actually targeting Iran itself. How can the Iran war impact the Axis groups, and can they remain resilient in the face of, a weakened Iran, and when their major benefactor has really suffered really significant loss in capabilities?
Thank you, Victoria, for the invitation. It's great to be with you and the Atlantic Council Iraq Initiative as well. The way that I would put it right now is each one of these groups is in survival mode. The status quo that was built over several decades as part of, Iran's forward defense, this idea that Iran not wanting to fight directly with Israel or adversaries would fight via these groups in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen. That has clearly changed. And even up to, last year, Iran was still trying to hold on to the status quo and not hoping that things would kind of blow over. And I think in this war, this latest iteration of this war, the US and Israel and Iran, there is a kind of realization by Iran that this is it. Something will change. There is not just a rethinking of its defense doctrine, but it is, destabilizing the region and all over the region in an effort for its own survival. So when it comes to these groups, they're seeing this. And some of them are having to make calculations on what does survival look like. For some, it's about doubling down on their positions in their own states and in their own governments. So in Iraq, for example, you've had several of these groups, the Badr Organization, Asab al-Haq, other groups in the Popular Mobilization Forces that have not wanted to be part of this war because they're in the Iraqi government, they have access to wealthy state coffers, the economy is good, the politics is good, they're becoming state actors. You have also questions around the Houthis and the extent to which they're dealing with their own trying to maintain stability within their own state, their relationships recently with Saudi Arabia, even, I mean, and the extent to which they might want to or not want to be part of this war. And I think in Lebanon as well, there was certainly a debate on whether Hezbollah should or should not engage in this latest round. Nonetheless, there are other actors, those that I would say are more tied to Iran's project, the actual resistance groups. So in Iraq, for example, groups like Kitab Hezbollah, Kitab Sayyid al-Shuhada, Harakat Hezbollah Najabat, these groups are less connected to Baghdad, for example, and see more of an existential threat with a weakened Iran, or a new region where Israel has primacy. And because of that, they are the ones now engaging in violence. In fact, they were restrained for a long time by both Baghdad and Tehran, but they are now engaging in violence because the game is changing. The structures of violence, the logics of violence, and the equilibriums are all changing. And the same is, true with Hezbollah. There are groups within Hezbollah certainly that are fighting Israel and that see this as a longer battle. And we'll wait to see, as you said, the extent to which the Houthis will feel that Iran is facing an existential threat. So to me, it's about what each group deems as being existential. The extent to which each group thinks that its interests are at stake, whether they be at the domestic political level in the government or they're losing their patron in Tehran. So when so when we talk about resilience and these groups and their adaptability, it's very much because they need to survive and they're finding different ways to survive. We also know that wars breed new waves of radicalization, and that when you have a mission accomplished, which will probably be announced in the next few weeks, as many expect, that years and years on, there's going to be, after the impacts of this war, one of which will be increased resistance as well. So for them, it's also a longer term fight.
Thanks, Renat. And maybe we'll come back to you here on this idea of the kind of fracturing or fragmentation within some of these groups and what that might mean for their strength moving forward. Now I'm going to turn to Nicholas. Obviously, among the Axis actors, Hezbollah's leadership and capabilities were really the most degraded in that post-October 7th period. And now Hezbollah finds itself actually in direct conflict with Israel. You've written recently that Hezbollah views the current conflict with Israel as the last war. Can you talk a little bit about the current situation in southern Lebanon and what this actually means in terms of Hezbollah's approach to the conflict? What does that, how does this, I guess, transpire if this is the last war?
First of all, Victoria, I have to apologize. I'm having some communication problems. It's the usual internet issues in Beirut. So if I suddenly go dead, you'll know why, and I'll try to reconnect. Basically, Hezbollah's gone into this fight believing this is the last war with Israel. And this is something they've talked about since the last conflict in 2006, that at some point there's going to be one last climactic battle with the Israelis. Either the Israelis will prevail or Hezbollah will prevail. And so they are all in this fight. They can draw upon around 30,000 fighters, I've been told. Obviously, not all of them are in South Lebanon at the one time. There's probably a few hundred guys down there at the moment. And essentially, they're trying to put pressure on the Israeli home front by hitting civilian population centers and military bases, as well as confronting Israeli troops on the ground in the south. But they are all in for this one. They're prepared for a long conflict.
And so, that being the case, maybe you could talk a little bit more. I mean, if they think this is the last conflict, how could they come out of this on the other side? I would say, as an outside observer, it's very hard for me to envision a scenario where Hezbollah is victorious against Israel. What would
Well,
be
I think
victory
victory
for
for
Hezbollah?
Hezbollah, yeah, I think victory for Hezbollah is going to be the survival of the Iranian regime, the ability of Hezbollah, and I don't see how this will happen, but the ability of Hezbollah to perhaps try to rebuild its military capabilities after this conflict. But I think that's going to be an impossibility under current circumstances here. But this was a decision that was made by Iran for Hezbollah to get involved in this fight. And there is a growing belief that the political leadership of Hezbollah really did not want to get into this fight at all. So under Naim Assem, who's been the Secretary General for the last year and a half, he has been steering the party in a slightly more Lebanon-centric direction. So there's been some reshuffling of appointments. People with more political backgrounds rather than military or security backgrounds have been promoted. That said, the Islamic resistance, the military component of Hezbollah, was undergoing restructuring with Iranian oversight following the November 2024 ceasefire. And I think there was a general consensus within Hezbollah, both the political leadership and the military leadership, that adamantly refused to lay down their weapons. Of course, the Lebanese government last August declared that they were going to disarm all non-state groups in the country, so primarily Hezbollah, and that process has sort of shuddered along a little bit since August until the outbreak of this current conflict. But I mean, I think we have to look at the role of Hezbollah at the moment as a component of Iranian strategy in the conflict with the US and Israel. So the interests of Hezbollah right now are subordinate to the interests of Iran.
Thanks, Nicholas. Allison, Renad alluded to this earlier, and of course, the Houthis have not entered the fighting so far. Despite a very clear Iranian desire to really escalate the conflict regionally, increase the pain in hopes to reestablish deterrence. Can you walk us through how we should view this Houthi decision not to enter the fighting and what this might signal about the relationship between the Houthis and Iran?
Thanks, Victoria. And I think the comments from my fellow panelists, I think, are quite interesting. The Houthis' mindset is very different than Hezbollah's in this last war mindset. I think they view this maybe not even about a war of survival, but as a war of adaptation. The fact is that the Houthis have for the entirety of the movement, seen themselves as independent. They have been highly dependent on Iranian support, but they've also sought to diversify that in recent years. And ideologically, their view of themselves is really as an Iranian partner, not as an Iranian proxy. And so I think that number one, they're probably inclined to believe some of the messaging we've seen coming out of Tehran, that the Iranians are confident about their ability to essentially outlast the US and Israeli campaign. I think that has strong parallels to what the Houthis did against Saudi Arabia. So number one, I think they will probably remain hopeful about the Iranian regime survival. And even if the regime does collapse, I think the Houthis could continue absent that Iranian support. They would have to adapt. It would be a huge blow to them, both economically and militarily, but I think they could survive. And so I think that is shaping the Houthis' decision-making as they're weighing involvement. A lot of people have focused on this idea that perhaps the Iranians are actually holding the Houthis in reserve. That could be true. They could see strategic value in that, but given the intensity of Iranian attacks, which have increased on Saudi Arabia and targeted Yanbu, the site that the Saudis are currently dependent on for oil exports, I'm inclined to think that the Houthis' restraint has more to do with their own internal decision making. And I think that distinction is important because it's going to shape both whether the Houthis get involved and how they get involved. I think the Houthis are weighing a pretty tough cost benefit calculus inside of Yemen about their involvement. We've seen the Houthis in the Gaza war. While they suffered significant military and economic costs from US and Israeli strikes against them, the benefits were just so much greater at that time when they could, number one, defend to the Yemeni people that these costs were worth it because they were, supporting the Palestinian cause, something that Yemenis feel quite deeply about. And this was the point where the Houthis were first breaking onto the international stage and proving themselves as a major player. And that simply is not the case on either front right now. And the big question for the Houthis is their détente with Saudi Arabia. They've been in this détente for 4 years, and the Houthis, they're still pursuing this project of cementing their control inside of Yemen. They don't even control all of historical North Yemen, and they don't control any of the country's oil and gas resources. And they've been hopeful that détente with Saudi Arabia could help cement that control, but they have reasons to be questioning that now. And they may determine that it makes sense to go back to the path they were pursuing before 2022, and that was to try to cement that control militarily. So there's a lot of moving parts inside of Yemen that is going to be shaping their calculus. And I think they will likely seek, knowing the Houthis, to extract as much as they can from Saudi Arabia with the increased leverage they have with the Strait of Hormuz closed, before making any determinations about whether or not to get involved and what that looks like.
Thanks, Allison. So Renata, I want to come back to you. You've written previously about the relationships between the various Axis groups, and how that has really contributed to their resilience. And I think particularly in Iraq, we have examples of Hezbollah leaders and advisors playing a key role. We've seen Houthis pop up in Iraq, sometimes providing some advisory support, and fighting with groups like Kataib Hezbollah. How critical is that to enabling the groups to survive this current period? And do you see that continuing? When we see these kinds of, I think, breaks between the various groups in terms of their own decisions and how to enter this fight, and what is best for their survival.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think looking at the groups in Iraq is a good lesson in what comes after decapitation. To some extent, because even before October 7th, in January 2020, with the U.S. Attack and assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC general, but also with him, the PMF de facto leader, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, you saw a far more fragmented group in the Popular Mobilization Forces, which were already quite fragmented, but even more. And so I don't see the decision-making structure like Allison is describing in terms of, the Houthis, having a top-down to some extent decision based on strategic interests, and to some extent, Hezbollah. It'd be great to hear Nick's thoughts internally about the extent to which the sort of decapitation of Hezbollah has created, this type of internal fragmentation. But certainly in Iraq, what we learned is the removal of a leader never meant the end of these groups. It actually meant just the proliferation of all sorts of different groups and all sorts of different leaders. Some of them, especially the bigger ones, Qais al-Khazali, Hadi al-Amri, those who are in the government, are very worried right now about falling into the trap. They've seen Iran hit, they've seen Lebanon hit, they've seen their colleagues in many countries hit, and they certainly don't want to be in the line of fire. And as I said, their interests are to stay away and to focus on Iraq's oil industry, which allows for much more profit than any other side hustle. At the same time, you have other groups that are less embedded, Kataib Hezbollah particularly, which has then sought to have better relations with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis, particularly because that axis, that transnational group, is not just a security or a political and ideological, but also an economic benefit. And we've seen, even in beyond the Middle East, in parts of Africa and elsewhere, these groups starting to work together, trying to figure out how can they produce drones, how can they produce all sorts of different economic benefits. We've seen them, as part of massive supply chains in the fuel industry and all sorts of other industries. So they are neighbors, and the extent to which they are neighbors means that they do have interactions and they do look for business opportunities with each other. Hezbollah as well has significant business opportunities in Iraq and alliances there. So to answer your question, I think it's a war. And, wars have been, to some extent bad for some businesses and probably okay for other types of businesses. Of course, I think their lines and connections have been hit and they're very worried. I mean, they don't use technologies in the same ways that they used to in terms of communications. But I think we'll have to wait and see after this how it's not a question of whether they adapt or not. It's a question of how they adapt and what these groups end up becoming after this war.
Thanks, Renat. So, Nicholas, I think Renat set you up very well to talk a little bit more about these divisions within Hezbollah that you referred to earlier, and I know have also written about. Are these divisions actually relevant right now? Since, as you noted, Iran essentially forced Hezbollah into this fight. And, if these divisions in fact are revealing, some divergence between Iranian goals and the goals of Hezbollah's political leadership, what does this mean about Hezbollah's continued ability to survive within the Lebanese political system?
Well, look, first of all, we shouldn't overstate the disagreements within Hezbollah. I mean, there have always been disagreements within Hezbollah. They're just very good at keeping it behind closed doors. So I think, Hezbollah is obviously in a very difficult situation after the results of the last round in 2023, 2024. There's all the pressure on Hezbollah to disarm, some bold decisions taken by the Lebanese government, unprecedented in wanting to disarm Hezbollah, bring the monopoly of violence to within the Lebanese state. But I think the bottom line is that Hezbollah is essentially a military organization. So when it emerged in 1982 in the wake of the Israeli invasion, it didn't arise with a desire to build hospitals and schools for the betterment of the Shia community in Lebanon. It was born with a gun in the hand to resist the then Israeli occupation. So all the other facets of the organization, whether it's the parliamentary presence, whether it's the seats in government, whether it's the social welfare apparatus, these have all been bolted on during the course of its existence to sustain, nurture, and protect what they call the resistance priority. So even though there are some fundamental about policy choices within the organization, they were all agreed, including Naim Assem, on the importance of maintaining the military capabilities. Because at the end of the day, if you take away the military capabilities, if they unilaterally decided to disarm, then they're no longer of any use to Iran. So Iran may then say, well, we're not going to give you any more funding. You're on your own. Good luck. And if that was the case, then Hezbollah would not be able to afford to maintain its schools, its clinics, its hospitals. They would have to let go thousands of doctors, teachers, nurses, on top of the tens of thousands of fighters that they've just demobilized. And this is not going to, you're going to have a big chunk of the Shia community in Lebanon who are not well disposed towards Hezbollah, having suddenly been made redundant. And that may be reflected in the following parliamentary elections. It'll lose its influence to be able to secure seats in government. And you'll end up with a hollowed out political structure. And none of this is very appealing to anybody in Hezbollah's leadership, which is why they feel it's so important to maintain this military component, even though there are disagreements about whether they should join this current conflict, because they know it's potentially existential for the organization, not only for the military capacity of Hezbollah, but perhaps even for the political component as well. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah is very tightly intertwined with the Iranian leadership. And if the Iranian leadership says jump, they jump. And this is basically what happened. And it seems to me that from conversations Islamic resistance directly, and said, right, we're going to start hitting the Israelis together, bypassing the political leadership. Now, that is a moot point right now because they are in this fight together collectively, and Naim Assem has given several speeches along these lines. We'll have to see in the there are too many variables at the moment to say with any of this conflict. But although there are some disagreements within the party, they are as one right now in this existential struggle against Israel.
Thanks, Nicholas. Allison, turning to you, you referred earlier, I think, to something many people have discussed about whether the Houthis are really a proxy or more of a partner. How significantly would a weakened Iran impact the Houthis? I mean, we've seen that they do have a certain capacity even to build their own weapons. We've also seen them kind of conduct a more independent foreign policy, referring to the negotiations they've had with the Saudi leadership over the years. Can you talk a little bit about, what the actual impact was? If Nicholas is describing, a Hezbollah, which, it feels it would need to go down with the Iranian ship, is that really the case for the Houthis? And, how can the Houthis, continue their own kind of independent policy in the absence of a strong Iran?
It's a great question. The Houthis are not dependent on Iran for their ideology. The Houthis have their own ideology that is aligned with that of Iran's and other members of the Axis of Resistance, but they can that ideology would not be broken by the loss of the Iranian regime and their role in the Axis of Resistance. The Houthis are not dependent on Iran for command and control that is indigenous, even if there is some IRGC presence inside of Yemen helping with the Houthi activities. The Houthis have been heavily reliant on Iran for weapons and expertise, but as you noted, they've been developing more of those capacities indigenously over the years, recognizing that that was necessary for their own sustainability. So I think I would point to a really great report from the Century Foundation that came out earlier this year, that if you analyze the interdictions of weapons that have gone to the Houthis in recent years, 35% of the material is actually coming from China, not Iran. About 20% is coming from Iran. So you've seen the Houthis diversifying their supply chains and seeking components rather than full weapons, and then compiling those weapons inside of Yemen. So the Houthis would definitely be impacted. We've seen a lot of the more advanced missile components still coming from Iran as part of these interdictions, but they could try to find those from other sources. There's significant reporting during the Houthis' Red Sea campaign that the Russians were going to be sending them missiles and other advanced weapons, and pulled back at the last minute. But certainly I can see the Houthis rekindling that in the wake of if the Iranian regime does collapse or stop its support. The Houthis have also benefited economically from Iran, I think less substantially and less significantly than Hezbollah for sure, but the U.S. Treasury recently reports that the Houthis got $2 billion from Iranian illicit fuel. So we could see that getting squeezed already, because those illicit fuel markets depended on intermediaries in Dubai, and we've seen the Emiratis say that they're going to crack down on some of that shadow behavior. So that would force the Houthis. They're already in an economic crunch, but again, they could seek to get these revenues from other sources. Again, seeking to capture Yemen's oil and gas resources, seeking to extort Saudi Arabia or any shippers that want to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb. The Houthis have means to bear the costs that they would suffer from a weakened Iran. And I think that, you could, in some ways, that adaptation, to go back to Renan's point, is not about whether they adapt, but instead how. I think there's a scenario in which you could actually see a more robust Houthi movement if they deepen their relationship with Russia, if they assume a more of a leadership role within the Axis, if they broaden their alliances. You know, we've alluded to the connections in the Horn of Africa and the Houthi relationship with al-Shabaab. I think you can at the same time seek to maximize their leverage over the Bab el-Mandeb. I think you could actually see a stronger Houthi movement. And again, there's been a lot of points in the past 20 years where people have underestimated the Houthis and thought that a certain new development was going to crack them. And in almost every case, they've emerged stronger. So I think we need to avoid underestimating the group's capacity for adaptation.
Thanks, Allison. Renata, I'm going to come back to you, but first I'm going to remind our audience to please put your questions into the chat and askac.org. Renad, you've been skeptical in some of your writing about the possibility of military action really being sufficient to dismantle the Axis groups. But, can the current military offensive, create conditions that might enable the kind of political settlement that would allow, states to reassert control? And, specifically in Iraq, I think we're seeing, the Iraqi militias, and, not only engaged in a fight right now against the United States, also escalating against some of the Gulf countries. But, over the weekend, it's pretty clear they're also targeting the Iraqi state, and hitting the INIS headquarters. How does this end, or how could this end for the Iraqi militias?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. INIS, Iraqi intelligence, the state's intelligence service, was hit by these militias. And really, there's always been a question that many have asked, the extent to which will there be a time when this Iraqi government, which is trying to play a game of multi-alignment, trying to say we have relations with everyone, except for Israel, of course, but with the US, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, but also an Iraqi government that has been pushed, I think, in a similar way with what's happening in Lebanon, to see an opportunity here to go after some of these militias. And certainly there's been several prime ministers, Kadhimi and now Soudani even, who have stressed Iraq's sovereignty, who have stressed this idea of integration, and an end to these militias. So the fact that they are now attacking not just U.S. Bases and U.S. interests, but also government offices, which they claim to be, they claim because those offices have relations with the U.S., means that there can be a whole new chapter potentially in this war in Iraq, which will be much bloodier and bring back those memories of the civil war in 2006, 7, and 8 with the Jaish al-Mahdi, and some of these militias do come from that time, fighting against the Iraqi government then. So to answer your question then, in 2003, when the US invaded and occupied Iraq, I don't think many, and I remember not many were talking about this as creating an Iranian empire in Iraq and the region, right? Many did not predict this. And I think one of the challenges of these types of military operations is the sort of mission accomplished is yes, the first step. And yes, you can have a military victory, especially with such superiority, shock and awe, as Rumsfeld was calling it. But what you cannot control is, as we've been saying in all of these countries, how groups adapt, how populations are radicalized. And there needs to be much more thinking on the day after. There is now in Iraq, for example, serious momentum to break free from Iran's grip, from the politicians, not just civil society. Of course, many are Iraqi nationalists who did not like the idea of having so much, being so much under the influence of Iran. So there is an opportunity here, but it's very delicate, and it's coming at a time of war. And because of that, the whole situation is so unpredictable that it's hard to see really a best case scenario coming out of this.
Thanks. So, Nicholas, turning to Lebanon and maybe discussing a little bit how the Lebanese state will deal with Hezbollah, or can deal with what could be a weakened Hezbollah coming out of this conflict. This morning we saw news that the Lebanese foreign minister had declared the Iranian ambassador persona non grata, which seems like a fairly significant step. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that specific move, but also what the Lebanese government and what the Lebanese state could do really to reassert more control, either now or at the end of this conflict. And it looks like we may have lost Nicholas briefly to Lebanese IT issues. So hopefully he will rejoin us momentarily. Allison, then turning to you, how do you see, this, the current situation with the Houthis, the current conflict, impacting what had been, still an ongoing challenge within Yemen? And how would the current Gulf security dynamics impact the Yemen conflict?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting something that Renaud was saying about a scenario in which this conflict could push Iraq into a renewed civil conflict. And in a lot of ways, the same is true in Yemen. And perhaps it's not surprising, you take Iran, or at least weaken Iran in the equation, and then you see these groups again seeking to renegotiate the balance of power and perhaps being pushed to do so militarily. And so I think that's really what is playing out inside Yemen. I think with the Houthis, they are considering, the rather significant developments in December of last year when we saw the Saudi UAE rift emerge inside of Yemen. And the UAE, reportedly withdrew its forces, and Saudi Arabia, in the wake of that, has sought to consolidate its partners inside the internationally recognized Yemen government, who control much of southern Yemen. And again, all of Yemen's oil and gas resources that are currently non-productive. And I think most significantly, actually unifying the military command structure within the internationally recognized government, which for years had kind of been split between these Saudi-aligned and Emirati-aligned groups, and really been set up to eventually negotiate with the Houthis, not as an effective governing or military body. And so with the Saudis' consolidation of that control, it opens up the question of, well, now can this government, can this military re-engage with the Houthis militarily? And so the Houthis are watching that. I think it's shaping their calculus again about whether or not their negotiations with Saudi Arabia can help them cement their control, get the concessions that they've been demanding since 2022, which essentially is reparations, control over oil and gas resources, and effective control over the Yemen government. So essentially a victor's terms. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out. I think you could see either side reigniting the war, either the Houthis deciding that the Saudis are not going to give them these concessions through the détente, and so re-engaging in the fight, or the Saudis finally getting sick of the Houthis' attempts to extort increasingly greater concessions from them. I think the concern here is that Saudi Arabia is currently distracted. It's a big country, and they're currently aiming their air defenses towards Iran, towards the east. And if the Houthis start escalating renewed cross-border attacks, they will be forced to also aim those air defenses towards the south at a time when we're also seeing Gulf countries exhausting their munitions in an attempt to defend against Iranian attacks. So that could, the Houthis could assess that this is an opportune time for them to reignite the fight against Saudi Arabia. So it's a lot of moving parts, but certainly a bit of an inflection point for the Yemen conflict.
Thanks. And I see we got Nicholas back. Nicholas, we were just talking about, how the current conflict, will, really could change or could shape, the ability of the Lebanese state to reassert itself against Hezbollah. And I was mentioning the decision by the Lebanese Foreign Ministry to declare the Iranian ambassador persona non grata. Can you talk a little bit about how you view that decision and how, what might maybe a weakened Hezbollah could allow the Lebanese state to assert some greater control?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I apologize again for the communications problems. The internet has been noticeably worse since this conflict renewed. Again, I think it all depends what happens in Iran. What happens in Iran is going to trickle down and have the impact on Hezbollah. So at the moment, we have had some fairly tough rhetoric from some Hezbollah officials who have directed a great deal of anger towards the Lebanese government. On the day Hezbollah staged its first attack on 2nd of March, within hours, the Lebanese government had basically outlawed the Islamic resistance, Hezbollah's military activities, security activities, which is an unprecedented step. Now, it hasn't made any difference on the ground, of course. Hezbollah is fully into this fight, but there is very much a sense of a day of reckoning to come afterwards. So, for example, if the Iranian regime pulls through this conflict and still wants to maintain the relationship with Hezbollah, even though that could be extremely difficult in terms of rebuilding the military component, you may well see Hezbollah grow a little bit more assertive. There have been threats to topple the government, potentially not through political means, but by resorting to the street. I think a lot of people are concerned of a kind of a sectarian backlash. There was a lot of anger initially in the Shia community when Hezbollah got involved in this fight, because although since the November 2024 ceasefire, the Israelis have been hitting Hezbollah almost every single day, and Hezbollah has adopted what it called a policy of strategic patience. And so they didn't retaliate to assassinations, to attacks on their infrastructure and so on, let alone the Israelis occupying 5 positions along the border, preventing Lebanese from going back to the villages, many of which had been flattened from the previous round in 2023, 2024. So when Hezbollah decided to, or rather the Iranians told Hezbollah to start attacking Israel, obviously a lot of Shia Lebanese were dismayed by this, because this brought a great deal more suffering. You've had hundreds of thousands of people evacuated from South Lebanon up to the Zahrani River, which is just below Sidon. The Dahye, the southern suburbs of Beirut, have been emptied of its population, and it's created a huge humanitarian crisis. But I think that the longer that this conflict goes on, you're going to see gradually some elements of the Shia community going back and embracing Hezbollah, taking pride in Hezbollah bleeding Israelis, if they're able to do that, putting up a prolonged and stubborn fight. The tempo of operations by Hezbollah at the moment is greater than even the climactic 2 months of the last round in October, November 2024. And we're staging up to as many as 60 operations a day, which is a huge number. And as I said earlier, they are prepared to continue fighting for a long time. So we may have a situation where Hezbollah emerges from this war battered, perhaps determined to try to rebuild its capabilities, certainly still refusing to hand over its weapons, and angry towards the current government. And we could see that if the Lebanese government is under massive pressure, of course, between over the last year and a half, an obstinate Hezbollah that refuses to disarm, and an impatient administration in Washington that is pushing the Lebanese government to get on with this process of disarming Hezbollah. This is going to become much more critical, I think, after this current conflict ends. And you may see that the Shia community, in this very sensitive Lebanese sectarian kind of sentiment, will begin to rally more towards Hezbollah if they perceive that they, the other communities, if you like, are ganging up on them to disarm Hezbollah, in other words, to weaken were in the 1940s and the 1950s. Now, that's not necessarily the case, of course, but in this very sectarian and volatile environment that we have right now, that is a position that the Shia community could feel. And that's only going to strengthen sectarian divisions in the country, because for non-Shias, for Christians and Sunnis and Druze, they've had it with Hezbollah, for dragging Lebanon into yet another war, destructive war for Israel. And for this time round, essentially for the sake of a country that's 600-700 kilometers to the east, with which few Lebanese have much sympathy. And that has been perhaps demonstrated today by the Lebanese government's decision to grant persona non grata to the Iranian ambassador. They've told he's got to pack his bags and leave the country by Sunday. Now, that doesn't mean that Lebanon's severing diplomatic relations. The foreign ministry here was clear about that, but it is a very symbolic gesture that has already drawn the ire of at least two Hezbollah MPs.
Thanks, Nicholas. So I'm going to take questions from our audience. I'm going to ask a couple together, and I think, Renan, these may be best directed to you. This question from Ghassan Taki: how do Iranian advisors contribute to the structure and operations of the axis of resistance, and how might their role be affected by the ongoing war between the United States, Iran, and Israel? And then maybe paired with the death of Ali Larijani, what sort of shift in strategy can we expect to see from the IRGC's political elite regarding financial and military support to the axis of resistance?
Sure. Certainly, IRGC commanders are active across these geographies. In fact, they're also being targeted in these geographies, including in Baghdad recently by the Americans as part of this war. Yeah, I mean their role has been, and their role has changed, I think, and this is important. I mean, the way that this model was set up, it was set up by Qasem Soleimani as very much a sort of top-down model where Qasem Soleimani had this sort of this relationship that was very informal with many of these groups, going back historically to the 1980s when they were together, whether it was with Hezbollah in the 1980s as it was developed, but also with the Iraqi groups that were in Iran fighting against Saddam. So there was all of this history and there was all of this sort of structure. But Qasem Soleimani was very much in charge and leading. Certainly when, with his removal, with his killing, and the rise of Qaani to head the Quds force, which is the kind of force that does much of this IRGC policies in these countries, there was a change in the model to some extent. Yes, the IRGC officials are there. They're providing security support. They're providing economic, not support, but ideas and networking. Because of course, I think one of the biggest mistakes is thinking that these groups needed Iran financially. In fact, it's often the opposite, that these groups were facilitating for Iran significant revenues and ways to overcome sanctions. Nonetheless, in the new IRGC model under Qaani and others, it was much more decentralized. You had even, Hezbollah officials coming in to do both economic and security training in Baghdad with the different PMF groups. And you had the Houthis, of course, involved as well. And this is where the relationship changed, I'm sure. And I've heard, some of the Yemeni friends talk about Abdul Malik of Houthi, thinking he could one day maybe become, as Alison said, a potential leader of this axis. So they're there. It's much more decentralized, but certainly they see their role as supporting in any way. And as Nicholas said as well, if Iran needs them to act, some of them will act. So they're still there and they're being targeted in all of these countries. In terms of Larijani's killing, I think Larijani in recent times sort of became more influential in these groups. I mean, they had better relations and stronger relations with people like Shamkhani and others who were running the kind of portfolio for a very long time. I think, as many are saying in Iran, the IRGC is still very much in control. Many believe that the hardliners are now actually in more control, and moving towards a more revisionist Iranian security posture in the region. So I think very much that's what we should expect, a much more revisionist Iranian posture, looking to fight, to create chaos, and to basically show the impact of this war across the region.
Thanks, Renad. Nicholas, a question to you. Is there any conversation internally in Hezbollah to depend on alternative sources of political and financial support after the war, aside from support from Iran? And if so, what other actors is Hezbollah considering?
Well, Hezbollah has developed sources of revenue outside the Iranian government for decades, both legal and illegal sources of revenue. Um, those revenue channels have grown tighter in recent years, particularly since the previous round. So it's been harder to bring cash into Lebanon. The Lebanese government has tightened up regulations regarding the banking sector and finances, which has also made it more difficult. So the importance of the funding from Iran is absolutely critical. Now, if Iran does stop funding, it doesn't mean that Hezbollah automatically collapses. It could continue, but it would certainly have to tighten its belt. But again, I think, it's premature almost to try to figure out what Hezbollah is going to do when this conflict's over, because we have to see how the conflict ends, what the end result is in Iran, which will then have determine the future of Hezbollah.
Thanks. And Renat, I have a question on the Kurds. What role are the Kurds playing in this equation? They have been the ones attacked most by the drones launched by the Iraqi militias. Of course, just this morning, the Iraqi Peshmerga were attacked. I think there were 6 killed. So can you talk a little bit about how the Kurds fit into this equation?
So the Kurdistan region of Iraq has, its leaders, both in Erbil and Slemania, have felt to some extent almost like sitting ducks, unable to really defend against much of this violence, asking the central government in Baghdad, why are you not able to stop these attacks when they are coming from your federal territory? And also a much more aggressive posture from Iran, which sees the Kurdistan regional government, especially Erbil, as being too close to the US at this moment. And also, in the past and currently, Tehran believes that Israel does still have, according to Iran, some kind of connection to the Kurdistan region. This is what Iran says, and what it uses to justify its attacks. So the Kurdistan region has actually been the most hit in Iraq from violence coming from Iran and its allies, and I think this will continue to be the case. As you said, there was a Peshmerga base that was hit. Several Peshmerga have been killed since this fight, and only to make matters more complicated, then there came the issue of the Kurds, Iranian Kurds, who are also based, many of them, in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. And when there was talks about whether Israel or the US are looking, the CIA is looking to train them or to support them, and for them to be the ground troops that the US does not want to send themselves, that made the Kurdistan region even more in a precarious position. So to some extent, they're stuck. I know that recently there was a pipeline that was restarted that Brink, because Iraq is unable to get its oil and gas out at the moment. The only way really is going through Kirkuk and through the Kurdistan region. The Kurds opened the pipeline, so there is some economic relationship there. But I think I would say the Kurdistan region is a particularly precarious position right now.
Thanks, Renat. Another question, I think we can direct it to all of you. Politicians and civil society want desperately to break free from the grip of Iran. This is true in Iraq and Lebanon, and perhaps also in Yemen. For all of you to answer, how can U.S. policy prop up and propel the formal institutions to successfully disarm and dismantle these groups, while perhaps offering something durable enough to replace it? And maybe we can first go to Allison.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that inside of Yemen, there is a deep hostility to foreign intervention. And this was actually, a tendency that the Houthis weaponized in the war with Saudi Arabia. Even though the Houthis were not popular, they had, disrupted a popular transition process inside of Yemen. They were instituting new levels of repression and breaking civic norms across Yemeni society. By presenting themselves as the defenders against foreign aggression, they built up their popular base of support across the country and cemented their control. And there is a scenario if the Houthis do get involved in this war, what is very much seen as Iran's war, where that could be turned against them, where all of a sudden you have an opportunity to weaponize this idea of Iranian intervention inside of Yemen. And it's something, the Houthis for a very long time, and part of the reason that they present themselves as a partner, not a proxy of Iran, is to combat that narrative. Say, Iran's an ideological ally, but they are not that important. They are not the puppet masters keeping control of the country. And so I think if the Houthis were to get involved, there would be an opportunity for others, and you will probably see this from the Yemen government, to allege that the Houthis are doing so only at Iran's beckoning and are essentially, dragging Yemen further into suffering and war simply for the Iranians' sake. And I think that does open up a potential vulnerability with the Houthis.
Thanks, Allison. Nicholas, to you, how can U.S. policies propel formal institutions or strengthen formal institutions?
With great difficulty in Lebanon, because we've been now for the last year and a half, where, as I was saying earlier, you've got an obstinate Hezbollah that's refusing to disarm, and you have the impatient administration in the US that's demanding that the government and the Lebanese army move forward to disarm Hezbollah. But I think that the Lebanese leadership, particularly the president and the army commander, the president, of course, was the previous commander of the Lebanese army, and I think they wake up every morning and think, how do I prevent civil war breaking out on my watch? And this is the underlying concern amongst the political leadership here, is that if you do send the Lebanese army in forcibly to disarm Hezbollah, you're going to split the country, and you're going to have, so long as Hezbollah insists on keeping its weapons, you're going to have a very unpleasant situation, which could potentially lead to the fragmentation of the army, and just make matters worse. Really, there is not a simple solution for US policy in Lebanon. There are some things to do. For example, to maintain US support for the Lebanese army. The Americans have invested a great deal of funds and time over the last, nearly 20 years now, and they have improved the capabilities of the LAF. But I think the real answer is in Iran. Iran holds the purse strings here, if you like. And if a deal can be cut with between the Americans and the Iranians that involves Hezbollah, then things can settle here quite easily. But otherwise, I can't really see a solution in Lebanon, regardless of whatever steps the US government takes towards Lebanon, until Hezbollah can be persuaded to put down its weapons, or ordered indeed by the Iranians to put down the weapons.
Thanks, Nicholas. Renaud?
Yeah, I agree. This type of international state building is almost impossible. And the Americans have a very difficult time finding leverage in these institutions. We've always said that, the problem here is building states and coherent state institutions that can represent Iraqis, that can represent these people in an accountable way. So I guess the first step would be to do less damage. And to recognize opportunities, when they're beginning to emerge. I mean, the last few governments haven't been necessarily anti-US from the kind of prime minister president level. Yes, there have been people in them who are historic opponents to the US, and it's all very fragmented, but it's a very delicate balancing act. And to just throw a hammer at it every few years certainly does not lead to the US helping Iraq break free from Iran's grip.
Well, thank you, Renat, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're at time. This has been a really rich and insightful discussion, and I want to thank our viewers at home for tuning in. And thanks again, and have a great day.